What if the biggest threat to America wasn't actually from outside our borders, but maybe from within? And what if the very institution we think of for protection, our military, actually held a surprising key to tackling that internal crisis? Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take fascinating sources you send our way, and we really unpack them, try to reveal the most important insights, maybe some unexpected connections. Today we're diving into a really thought-provoking and honestly deeply personal essay. It's titled Rethinking America's Army, a personal and national plea for survival. And it's by Dr. Lev Neimotin. Now, what makes this deep dive, I think, particularly compelling is Dr. Neimotin's approach. I mean, this isn't just some dry academic paper. It's an argument that seems forged out of real-world frustration, real heartfelt concerns. He's pretty open about it. He says his convictions came from late-night arguments with a close friend, from his, quote, disgust at inaction in our cities, talking about rising violence, and from this really profound fear that America is walking the path of imploding empires.
And he makes a point of saying, he writes, not as a partisan pushing some agenda, but, and this is his quote, as a citizen watching his country bleed from within. Okay, well, that personal angle, it feels almost visceral, and it really provides this powerful emotional engine for his whole argument, framing why he's calling for such a, radical rethink of national priorities.
Yeah, it's quite striking how he just immediately cuts to the heart of an assumption that, let's face it, many of us just accept, which is the need for a massive standing army that's mostly set up for foreign deployments, especially now in the 21st century. He's careful, though, he doesn't dismiss the whole military structure. He makes a very clear and I think crucial distinction. Things like the Navy, the Air Force, the Space Force, specialized rocket forces, these, he flat out says, are absolutely essential, vital for modern defense, projecting power, protecting interests globally. But he sharply critiques the logic behind keeping, quote, hundreds of thousands of troops standing on call for foreign deployments. That model, he argues, designed for big land wars or occupations, that belongs to the 20th century, not the 21st.
Oh, yeah.
Cool. And that really forces you to ask a pretty critical question, doesn't it? If our whole geopolitical landscape has genuinely shifted so much since the Cold War, away from maybe big nation-state invasions towards more diffuse threats, asymmetric warfare, internal challenges, shouldn't our military strategy, the very structure of our forces, evolve just as radically? It's a direct challenge to kind of the inertia of established defense thinking.
That really is a fundamental question, isn't it? And one you don't often hear debated quite so directly. So our mission today is to really unpack Dr. Neimotin's impassioned argument. We'll dig into the history he uses, including some surprising lessons from empires that fell, and even America's own founding ideas. We'll explore the, pretty radical shift he's proposing for our military, and we'll also look at those deeply personal, quite emotional exchanges that seem to fuel his conviction. And the stark numbers he lays out that he says just demand urgent action. Throughout this deep dive, we'll keep trying to connect these dots back to the bigger picture. What does all this mean for America's future? And maybe for you, as someone watching what's happening in our country every day. Okay, let's start digging in. Hashtag tag to mark the personal genesis of a national question. Let's start maybe by really trying to grasp the personal source of this essay, because it feels like it genuinely shapes the urgency and, the passion behind Dr. Neimotin's plea for the nation. He calls the essay both personal and national. That tells you right there, his own anxieties directly mirror his worries for the country. His conviction, like he says openly, it doesn't seem to come from some detached academic study. It comes from lived experience. Those late-night arguments he mentioned, the ones that maybe forced him to really grapple with opposing views, that deep disgust at inaction he felt watching urban violence climb, and that very real fear that America is walking the path of imploding empires. This isn't theory for him. It feels like a gut-level cry for attention, rooted in his own distress. And framing it not as partisan politics, but as a citizen watching his country bleed from within, seeing these internal wounds he thinks are more dangerous than external threats. This personal stuff, it isn't just, background color. It feels like the emotional bedrock that gives his policy ideas such weight and moral urgency. He's kind of inviting us, you, the listener, to share his unease and look at the nation's future through his, frankly, very worried eyes.
Exactly. And building right on that personal conviction, Dr. Neimotin then turns his focus to what he sees as this, outdated military structure. He argues its design might be fundamentally mismatched with the very internal threats that worry him so much. He really emphasizes the unique geography of the U.S. I mean, think about it. Unlike so many nations throughout history facing constant threats of land invasion across shared borders, the U.S. is, as he puts it, surrounded by oceans and neighbors that pose no invasion threat. Now, that distinction's critical. Historically, nations with, vulnerable land borders needed big standing armies as their first line of defense against immediate attack. Nemo's basically saying that's just not the main reality for the U.S. in the 21st century. Now, he absolutely acknowledges, in fact, he advocates for the absolute essential nature of naval, air, space, and rocket forces. He gets that. Those are crucial for modern power projection, intelligence, precision strikes, all that in a globalized world. Where he draws the line is questioning the ongoing need for hundreds of thousands of troops standing on call for foreign deployments. He argues the whole logic for that kind of massive ground-based expeditionary force belongs to the 20th century, not the 21st.
Mm-hmm.
His point seems to be that the world has moved on from large-scale conventional land wars as the primary threat, but our military structure, especially the Army, hasn't really caught up, and that pushes us towards a really fundamental question, doesn't it? If the threats to national security have diversified things like cyber warfare, economic pressure, and crucially, internal social and political instability, what does it really mean for defense strategy when your main resources are still geared towards fighting conventional external wars that might not even be the most pressing danger anymore?
Right, and then he broadens that historical view, and this is where Dr. Nemotin makes a really interesting connection, I thought. He pulls us right back to the origins of America itself. He reminds us, maybe something we forget, that the Founding Fathers had this really profound, deep-seated distrust of standing armies. And this wasn't just some abstract philosophy, right? It came from their direct experience under British rule. They remembered soldiers being quartered in private homes, the military being used to enforce unpopular laws. That fear that a big permanent army could easily become a tool of tyranny, threatening the very liberties they fought for. James Madison, the key architect of the Constitution, he put it pretty vividly. He warned that a standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty. And for a lot of early U.S. history, that idea shapes policy. The country mostly relied on state militias, volunteers only building big armies for declared wars, and then largely disbanding them afterwards. So this history provides a really powerful backdrop for Nemotin's critique today. He's sort of suggesting that the sheer size and global reach of our current standing army is a major departure from that long-held American principle. It challenges us to think maybe we've kind of drifted away from a really vital part of our national DNA, that original caution about concentrated military power inside a republic.
Yeah, it's very insightful how he doesn't just stop with American history. He then widens the lens to look at this almost universal pattern and how great powers rise and fall. He argues that empires, more often than not, don't actually collapse because of some crushing external invasion or one big defeat on the battlefield. Instead, it's usually this slow, kind of insidious process of internal decay and, crucially, overextension. He brings up some potent examples. Rome, right, didn't just fall to one barbarian horde. It slowly exhausted itself, maintaining legions far away, fighting these long, costly wars on its frontiers, and all while dealing with, political corruption, economic problems, social fragmentation back home that just eroded its core strength. Or look at the British Empire. Huge, powerful, but eventually it just buckled under the massive financial and logistical weight of policing the whole globe, especially after the World Wars, which weakened it economically and fueled independence movements. And more recently, he points to the Soviet Union. Massive military, really formidable, but it ultimately bankrupted itself with crazy defense spending like the costly war in Afghanistan. And it imploded because of systemic economic failure and deep internal unrest, not because it was conquered from outside. This historical pattern is absolutely crucial because it's the foundation for Nemotin's deep fears about the U.S. today. He's drawing this stark parallel, basically implying that the internal health, the social cohesion, the financial stability of a nation that's paramount for long-term survival, much more so maybe than projecting military power abroad. He's really urging us to pay attention to these historical lessons, suggesting that ignoring them could lead us down a very similar path.
Okay, so with those historical warnings kind of echoing, what does this actually mean for us right now, today? Because Dr. Nemotin isn't just giving us a history lecture, right? He's sounding a pretty loud alarm, arguing that America is showing disturbingly similar signs of implosion to those empires that crumbled from the inside out. And this is where his historical point becomes really deeply relevant, maybe even chillingly relevant to right now. He claims America shows clear signs of internal decay. He specifically mentions decadence, moral exhaustion, and rising inner violence. He doesn't really mince words. He tells readers to just read the headlines in newspapers, visit social or only mildly censored so far public media to see the evidence. Think about the daily news cycle, right? The reports on crime rates in big cities, the political polarization that seems to just paralyze everything, the cultural clashes highlighting deep divides, that kind of widespread unease you see online. He's not just observing, he's making a diagnosis, directly linking these current trends to historical precedents of national collapse. So why should you, listening right now, care so much? Because he's asking you to look beneath the surface of the news, to analyze our everyday reality through this critical historical lens. He's challenging us to consider if maybe we're overlooking the very real signs of internal rot that have brought down seemingly invincible powers before. He really believes this isn't just abstract theory. It's happening now, demanding our urgent attention. Okay, so driven by these really deep concerns, Dr. Emoten puts forward a truly radical idea. One that really challenges decades of standard military doctrine and foreign policy. He actually credits the concept of former President Donald Trump. This idea of fundamentally redirecting our forces inward, with the explicit goal to, quote, save American lives instead of exporting democracy abroad. Now, he calls this a radical shift because it completely redefines the main purpose and deployment of a huge chunk of our military, specifically the Army and its reserves. It signals a strategic pivot, really, away from that whole post-Cold War mindset of global interventionism, sending troops for complex nation-building, counterterrorism, humanitarian missions far away. Instead, he highlights the idea of using military reserves domestically, not for conquest, but for roles addressing internal crises, like saving lives, supporting local police where homicide rates are high, protecting American families inside our own borders, rather than what he sees as often corrupt or ineffective regimes overseas. That stark contrast, save American lives instead of exporting democracy abroad, really captures this proposed shift in priorities. Focus resources and attention away from ambitious foreign goals towards urgent domestic needs. It makes you think, is our current definition of national security really broad enough? Or maybe it's too narrow to handle the complex, growing threats coming from inside our own country.
Yeah, and following right on that, Emoten's whole proposal to redirect military resources inward. It's directly backed up by a strong critique of what he sees as just systemic failures of past efforts to export democracy or impose stability using military force. He points to what he sees as a consistent, costly pattern, huge spending, human sacrifice, but yielding pretty limited positive results. He specifically names Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan as key examples. In these conflicts, he argues, it was trillions spent. Thousands of Americans killed, foreign societies unchanged. To elaborate a bit, he seems to see these interventions as proof of just how hard, maybe even futile it is to do nation building with military might, especially in places with deep cultural, religious, political differences. Vietnam, you had the struggle against an entrenched insurgency, a failure maybe to grasp local dynamics. Iraq, okay, swift military victory, but then a long insurgency, sectarian violence, a really tough occupation that arguably destabilized a region. Afghanistan, 2 decades of effort, huge investment in infrastructure, security forces, yet the government collapses almost immediately after withdrawal. That underscored the limits of external military solutions for lasting internal stability. So this analysis really bolsters his argument that the traditional use of a large standing army for these foreign interventions hasn't just been ineffective, it's been enormously costly in lives and money, often failing the stated goal of transforming societies. By stressing these perceived failures, he strengthens his case for an alternative inward focus. He suggests sticking to the old paradigm isn't just unsustainable, it's actively harmful to American interests, draining resources needed at home. And that perspective raises a pretty important question for us, doesn't it? Beyond the dollars and the human cost, what are the long-term impacts on a nation's global standing, its internal health, its strategic credibility, when these big military engagements consistently fall short of their goals?
Now, Dr. Emoten clearly knows that this kind of radical idea, sending federal troops into cities to deal with violence, is going to set off alarm bells for a lot of people. Fears of authoritarianism, government overreach. He anticipates that criticism and tackles it head on. He argues really strongly that his proposal is emphatically not authoritarianism. He calls it an urgent act of self-preservation, a fundamental fight for our survival as a nation. Now, that preemptive defense is absolutely crucial for his argument, especially for listeners who might instinctively recoil at the thought of federal troops on American streets, fearing a slippery slope towards martial law or suppressing civil liberties. He frames it not as some tyrannical power grab, but as a desperate, necessary measure of national self-care, designed to protect citizens and safeguard the nation's future when other ways have failed. He's asking you to look past that initial apprehension, consider the intent behind the action and the huge stakes involved. Is it, like some might say, an overreach of federal power? Or is it, from his view, a nation fighting for its very life, taking decisive action where other institutions have faltered? It's a really powerful reframing, urging us to grasp the gravity of the internal threats he sees.
Okay, and here's where Dr. Nemotin really brings his argument down to a deeply personal, almost raw emotional level. It illustrates the conviction driving his whole plea. He talks about a painful exchange he had with a dear liberal friend, an argument that really highlights the profound ideological gap he's trying to bridge. His friend, he explains, was adamant that the rising homicides in Chicago were purely local issues, insisting that states and cities had the sole responsibility to handle it with absolutely no federal intervention allowed. And this wasn't just a casual disagreement. Nemotin calls it painful, a clash of beliefs that shows the emotional toll this inaction takes on him. The detail about it being a liberal friend is significant too, because it emphasizes his attempt to get beyond the usual partisan lines. It shows his concern for lost lives overrides political labels. It really speaks to how deeply he feels about this, cutting across personal ties and political philosophies.
Yeah, and it's compelling how Nemotin, clearly fueled by that painful talk, directly pushes back against his friend's view. He argues passionately that when local authorities demonstrably fail to protect their citizens on such a devastating scale, the federal government doesn't just have a right, it has a profound moral and governmental responsibility to step in. He voices his frustration, saying, sure, cities and states have the main job, but when they fail to act, the federal government cannot just watch from the sidelines. He flatly declared the persistent violence in Chicago not just a local problem, but a national crisis. And to really drive home the urgency, the moral side of it, he asked his friend this stark, rhetorical question. It's designed to cut through the abstraction and hit the human cost. How many weeks of losing 11 people per week do you think justifies waiting for Chicago and its governor to take care of it? This bit is absolutely central to his whole argument for redirecting federal resources inward, because he sees the sheer scale, the consistency, the disproportionate impact of the violence as completely overwhelming local capacity. It transforms it, in his eyes, into an undeniable national emergency needing a federal response. And he's challenging you, the listener, to think about that critical question. At what point does a persistent local problem with such a devastating, ongoing human cost become a truly national crisis demanding federal attention and intervention? Where's that line?
Right, and as he recounts this argument, you can also feel his frustration, his conviction just ramping up. It leads to this really powerful accusation of what he sees as a profound hypocrisy in politics today. He expresses outright disgust, saying that Democrats, who he notes scream about racism nonstop and champion social justice, are, in his view, effectively showing by their inaction that they do not value the lives of Black, Hispanic, and other people being lost every single week. His language there is really unfiltered. It's raw. It conveys just how deep his emotional and moral outrage runs. He quotes himself saying, "I am totally disgusted." And then in this passionate plea to his friend, and really by extension to all of us listening, he says, cross the party line already. These are incredibly strong statements. They go way beyond just policy critique. They question fundamental moral priorities, framing the perceived inaction as this deep ethical failure that should transcend partisan politics. It powerfully underscores his belief that lives being lost in American cities isn't just a political talking point. It's a fundamental humanitarian crisis about human dignity, the basic right to survive, an issue that should, in his view, unite people across all political divides.
And it's really significant that despite that argument, with his friend being unsuccessful described as painful, Dr. Nemotin's conviction didn't waver. In fact, it got stronger. He states very clearly, it didn't go well. But my conviction only deepened, because this is not about partisanship. It is about whether we act to stop death in our own streets. That unwavering resolve is crucial. It reinforces the essay's main message. This issue, the rampant loss of life in cities, it's fundamentally about human life and national survival. It should, he argues, rise above and unite people beyond political divisions. It really emphasizes his passionate commitment to the value of human life itself, the urgent need for action, rather than just sticking to a specific political script or party line. He's making a plea for a humanitarian response that puts lives ahead of ideological purity, suggesting that if we can't even agree on the basic need to save lives within our own country, then maybe our political system has failed its most fundamental job. It underscores his belief that this crisis is existential, demanding we rethink what it means to be a functioning nation.
Dr. Nemotin doesn't just rely on emotion or history, though. He backs his argument with hard, really undeniable numbers. Statistics that, he argues, demand urgent action and a serious look at our national priorities. He gives specific, stark figures for Chicago, focusing on that one-year period between April 2023 and April 2024. And during that time, the data shows this deeply disturbing disparity. Black residents were tragically 20 times more likely than white residents to be homicide victims in the city. 20 times. Hispanic residents face a similar, though slightly lower, disproportionate risk, nearly 5 times more likely than whites, to be homicide victims. And taken together, Black and Hispanic individuals made up a staggering 95% of all homicide victims in Chicago during that year. 95%. These specific stark percentages, 20x, 5x, 95%, they provide the concrete, undeniable evidence for his claim of a national crisis. They show a devastating human cost hitting specific communities with alarming regularity, stripping away any ambiguity, painting a clear, unvarnished picture of the human tragedy he's talking about.
Yeah, and it's particularly powerful how he then frames the sheer volume of these deaths. He uses this really vivid, disturbing analogy. It's clearly designed to shock listeners into realizing the true gravity of it all. He points out those grim stats translate to 600 plus homicides in 1 year, about 11 funerals every week. 11 funerals every single week. Then comes the provocative comparison. He equates this consistent toll to a mass shooting's worth of death repeated weekly. While he nights with clear frustration, politicians often just shrug. Oh, is that it? Now, that comparison is incredibly potent because it forces you to rethink how we perceive ongoing chronic violence, especially compared to the immediate national outrage, the wall-to-wall media coverage, the urgent calls for action that follow a single high-profile mass shooting. It highlights what he sees as this profound desensitization to internal chronic violence, especially when it disproportionately hits marginalized communities. He's essentially asking you, the listener, to really visualize the immense, continuous human cost of these weekly tragedies, and to ask yourself why such consistent, devastating loss of life within our own cities doesn't trigger a comparable national response to other forms of violence. It really pushes us to critically question our collective moral calculus and what actually manages to capture our national attention.
And that leads him to draw this really powerful contrast, one that truly hammers home his central point about our nation's maybe misplaced priorities and how differently we react to tragedy. Dr. Moten states it quite emphatically. If this same level of death, this horrifying reality of a mass shooting's worth of death repeated weekly, if that were happening from foreign attack, the nation would mobilize instantly. End quote. He suggests the response would be immediate, unified, overwhelming. Resources deployed without a second thought. But then he concludes with this biting observation. Because it is internal, excuses abound. That comparison directly challenges our national priorities, the whole rationale behind where and why military or federal resources get deployed. It implies this critical misalignment between where resources currently go mostly towards external threats and where lives are consistently tragically being lost right here within our own borders. He's asking us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that maybe we have a different standard for human suffering, for what constitutes a national emergency, depending on whether it comes from outside or from within our country. It's a stark call to reevaluate what really threatens national security and, more fundamentally, human life itself.
Now, this provocative line of argument inevitably brings up a crucial question, one that always surfaces in American political debate. What about the Constitution? Specifically, the division of power, the role of the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment, as you know, it's a cornerstone of American federalism. It reserves powers not given to the federal government to the states or to the people. And it's often cited in debates about limiting federal intervention in things traditionally handled locally or by the state. Dr. Moten acknowledges this. He gets the constitutional principle, but he offers a really powerful counterargument. He asserts that while the 10th Amendment outlines state powers, it does not require the federal government to stand idle while Americans die. His point isn't to dismiss the Constitution. It's to argue for a necessary interpretation in extreme circumstances, where the basic safety and lives of citizens are clearly at risk on a massive scale. He directly confronts that constitutional hurdle, basically saying that the principle of states' rights, vital as it is, should not and cannot be used as an absolute shield for federal inaction when local and state governments demonstrably fail to protect their own citizens from large-scale, persistent, devastating violence. This interpretation suggests there's a higher duty, a moral, governmental, federal obligation when core functions like public safety, usually local, just catastrophically break down.
Right, and he expands on that with a pretty powerful accusation. He suggests that this concept of states' rights, while fundamental, is sometimes being misused, almost weaponized, effectively becoming a shield for failure. Dr. Moten states it unequivocally. Rights reserved to the states were never meant as a shield for failure. That's a really key, potent argument in his essay. He's putting forward the idea that the federal government has an inherent role, a fundamental duty to protect its citizens, especially in dire situations where local and state governance demonstrably fails to do so on a catastrophic scale. He implies the original idea behind the 10th Amendment was about delineating powers, preventing federal overreach in normal governance, not creating some loophole or excuse for inaction when facing widespread suffering, death, or a breakdown of order that threatens the nation's integrity. He's challenging the notion that just saying states' rights absolves higher levels of government from their ultimate responsibility to ensure the basic safety and well-being of the people. It forces us to consider the limits of state autonomy when the very lives of so many citizens are consistently at risk.
Which leads us to a fascinating and really critical point. Moten's clear assertion of a federal responsibility, maybe even a duty, to intervene in these extreme cases, where local and state mechanisms have just proven totally insufficient to protect lives. He emphasizes when local leadership and states clearly fail to stop the killings, the federal government must step in. And he's very careful to frame this proposed intervention not as tyranny, not as federal overreach, but rather as democracy acting through elected leaders and as the government protecting its citizens. He's arguing that in a working democracy, the government's primary job is safeguarding its people, and when one level fails, another has to step up. This interpretation reframes federal intervention. It's not some outside force imposing itself, but the fulfillment of a core governmental promise protecting its people, even from internal threats. Now, this raises several really important questions for us to think about. If we accept this idea, where exactly do you draw the line for federal intervention? What specific objective level of violence or societal breakdown would trigger that federal duty? And critically, what are the broader implications for that delicate, often tense balance of power between federal and state governments? Especially in an era where maybe persistent internal crises, not traditional external wars, become the bigger challenge to national security and stability. It's a really complex legal and philosophical tightrope he's walking.
Dr. Moten looks beyond just the immediate tragedy of these horrible statistics, these killings. He sees something much more ominous in them. He views them not just as isolated crimes or local failures, but as harbingers, profound, unsettling signs pointing towards America's slow internal unraveling. Much like the path taken by great societies and empires throughout history. He's really shifting our focus here from the individual, heartbreaking loss of life to a kind of macro-level diagnosis of national danger. For him, these killings aren't just crime stats. They're stark indicators, serious warnings pointing to what he calls America's slow unraveling, a process of internal decay, a weakening from within rather than some external conquest. This perspective powerfully connects back to his earlier historical point about empires imploding from the inside. He's suggesting that what we're seeing in our cities is part of a larger, more dangerous trend threatening the very fabric of the nation. He's explicitly linking localized violence to a macro-level societal breakdown, painting a truly sobering picture of potential national decline if these symptoms aren't addressed head-on.
Yeah, and if we connect that back to the broader historical patterns he talked about, Dr. Moten identifies several interconnected factors he believes are critically fueling this insidious internal decay, pushing America towards what he fears could be an implosion. He paints this comprehensive picture of societal fragmentation. First, he points to growing lawlessness. That suggests a breakdown in civil order, less respect for the law, maybe a sense of impunity for crime, whether petty or violent. Next, he highlights the erosion of shared values, implying a dangerous loss of common ground, unifying principles, civic norms that historically hold a diverse society together. You see this in heightened political polarization, cultural battles preventing consensus. Furthermore, he identifies the elevation of ideology over common sense, suggesting that rigid political doctrines, partisan loyalties are increasingly trumping practical solutions, rational discussion, the willingness to compromise for the common good. And maybe most critically, he pinpoints a refusal to face our problems directly, which speaks to a kind of collective avoidance, denial, or just a lack of political will to confront the deep-seated issues festering within the nation. These, in his view, are the many symptoms of the internal rot he's referencing. He's painting a stark picture of a society that's slowly but surely losing its coherence, its foundational strength, its very ability to self-correct and heal itself, echoing the paths of those empires that collapsed from within.
And this brings him to what might be one of his most chilling and maybe most morally urgent observations. It's the insidious acceptance of this ongoing violence, this weekly tragedy, as somehow normal. He issues this stark warning: when we allow weekly killings of young men and women, mostly black and Hispanic, and accept it as normal, we signal not strength, but decline. That repetition of the word normal there is incredibly powerful, isn't it? And deeply unsettling. It highlights what he sees as this tragic, almost insidious acceptance, this desensitization within our society, suggesting we've just gotten used to a level of internal violence and suffering that should be utterly unacceptable, deeply shocking. He sees this as a profound moral failing, a dangerous sign of a society losing its ethical compass, its capacity for collective outrage when faced with persistent injustice. It suggests a society that has, for whatever reasons, become complacent about its own internal suffering.
Which brings us directly to his stark warning. It's a truly provocative statement that powerfully echoes his earlier historical analysis and really sums up the core fear driving his whole essay. He concludes the section by stating flat out, "Empires fall this way, and unless we act, so will we." Unquote. This raises a profoundly important question for all of us to grapple with, I think. What are the long-term, maybe irreversible consequences when a society, a nation, becomes so desensitized to its own internal suffering, to the persistent loss of life within its own borders, that it just accepts it as the status quo? What does that desensitization do to a nation's soul, its moral fabric, its civic health, and ultimately its very capacity for collective action and survival? It forces us to confront the potential cost of our collective inaction and the profound risk of just letting these internal wounds fester unchecked. #tag a national plea beyond party lines.
Dr. Nemotin brings his essay to this really powerful, impassioned conclusion. He reiterates his core message with an urgent plea that explicitly tries to rise above the usual political divides. This really feels like the emotional peak of his argument, where his deep personal conviction meets his national alarm. He emphasizes very directly, this is not about Trump versus Biden. It is not about left versus right. It is about survival. It is about whether America still has the courage to save itself. That's a direct, urgent challenge to you, the listener. To move beyond the partisan bickering and recognize what he sees as an existential threat to the nation, his passion here is just undeniable. It cuts through the political noise to appeal to a more fundamental sense of national identity, collective responsibility. He's calling for a moment of unity, really. An urgent recognition of a shared crisis that, in his view, demands a shared solution, one that gets above the political fray.
Yeah, and what's particularly insightful here is how he then carefully reframes that controversial idea of using military reserves internally. He directly addresses those potential fears of authoritarianism, of militarization. He clarifies, our reserves are not outsiders. They are us, fathers, mothers, neighbors. That's a crucial detail, right? It humanizes the military. These aren't foreign invaders or some anonymous force. They're fellow citizens called to service. He argues using these reserves temporarily to restore order, save lives in collapsing cities is distinctly not martial law. Instead, he reframes it. He calls it an act of compassion and democracy defending itself. He directly contrasts it with past totalitarian regimes, stating, this is not a Soviet-style action. This is America acting for America.
Wow.
That distinction is vital for his argument. It shifts the perception away from an external imposition of order towards an internal mechanism of self-preservation. The military acting as an extension of the community itself, focused on immediate life-saving and stabilization. Now, this raises an important question for us to think about. How can the public perception of temporary, focused military intervention in extreme internal crises be effectively shifted? Away from fears of authoritarian overreach towards a sense of national unity, compassionate protection for the most vulnerable citizens. It represents a significant psychological and political hurdle he's trying to clear, demanding a profound shift in how we even conceive of national defense.
He then delivers this direct, really urgent challenge to all of us, mirroring that impassioned challenge he posed to his friend in that argument he described. He tells us, unequivocally, we must stop pretending this is someone else's problem. It is ours. It is now. He leaves no room for looking away, delaying, passing the buck. Then he uses these powerful rhetorical questions, designed to provoke deep self-reflection in you, the listener, and maybe in the nation as a whole. He asks with real force, if we cannot cross party lines to save lives, then what are we? And then, raising the stakes even higher, he questions, if we cannot summon federal leadership to stop our cities from bleeding, then perhaps we are already imploding. These aren't just questions, are they? They feel like a direct moral indictment, a profound challenge to our collective will, our capacity for self-governance. He's asking us to look inward and really assess our priorities.
And yet, despite all those stark warnings, all his deeply troubling assessments of where America might be heading, Dr. Nemotin concludes with this powerful, almost defiant belief in America's enduring capacity to act, to overcome these profound challenges. He states, but I refuse to accept that. I still believe in America, and I believe we must act together beyond parties, beyond ideology, to stop the killings, save our cities, and reclaim our future before it is too late. That ending note of conviction, despite the bleak diagnosis, it offers this crucial glimmer of hope, doesn't it? It transforms his plea into a call to action, one rooted in this profound, persistent faith in the nation's ability to self-correct, to rise to its challenges. And this raises an important final question, one he implicitly puts to all of us. What tangible steps can be taken beyond the entrenched political divides, beyond ideological purity tests, to actually address these deep-seated, persistent issues he describes? And maybe even more critically, how can we foster the kind of national unity, the shared purpose that would be absolutely necessary to implement such urgent, life-saving measures across the country? Hashtag Taj Outro Vest.
So we've taken a deep dive today into Dr. Levny Moten's really powerful essay, Rethinking America's Army, a personal and national plea for survival. We've explored his passionate, meticulously argued case that our nation faces an existential threat not primarily from outside, but from within, and that our very understanding of national defense needs a radical, introspective shift, one that looks to save lives on our own streets, maybe before anything else.
Yeah, it's truly compelling how his own deeply personal struggle, those tough late-night arguments, his profound disgust at inaction, his palpable fear for the country's future, it doesn't just stay as background. Instead, it really fuels this powerful national plea for survival, one grounded in both stark historical warnings about empires falling and those urgent, undeniable statistics about the devastating human cost of violence in our cities. He's asking all of us, really, to look unflinchingly at the cost of inaction and to profoundly reconsider our fundamental national priorities and our defense strategies.
So what does all this mean for you? Dr. Nemoten's essay leaves us with a profound, pretty urgent challenge, echoing those direct questions he asks. If we cannot cross party lines to save lives, then what are we? If we cannot summon federal leadership to stop our cities from bleeding, then perhaps we are already imploding. His words really compel us to think deeply. Is America truly facing an internal implosion? And if it is, what responsibility does each of us bear, beyond our political labels, beyond our ideological comfort zones, to demand and maybe enact action? For a future where our cities are safe and our nation truly thrives from within, can we move past those divides to confront the very real human suffering he highlights? Can we redefine what it means to defend America in the 21st century? Keep those questions with you, and keep diving deep into the issues that matter most.